What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games with endings that I really enjoyed, following on from yesterday's video about endings I really didn't enjoy that much for one reason or another. But the trick here is, this video was what I wanted to do the entire time, specifically so I could talk a little more about Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, which is a game whose story I really loved, and I wanted to find a way to talk about the ending. But hey, where's the fun in just making a video specifically about that, I suppose? So more on that to come, for sure. I've played a lot of games, seen many an ending, and it's hardly a secret then that some are simply better than others, and as a result of that, the endings that stick with me the most tend to be ones that register with me emotionally for some reason or another. Otherwise, when I get to the end of the game, I'm usually just like, yep, that's neat, and I move on with my day. But like Clair Obscur that I just mentioned earlier, there are some games with endings that tend to stick with me, which I think is especially relevant when you play as many games as I do. Reality is that sometimes it's hard to remember ones that I really didn't even care that much about to begin with in terms of their overall story. Like, I just wasn't fully invested in them. And I mean, I've played hundreds of games. Some of them are just not going to be on the tip of my tongue, you know? Whereas plenty of others find a way to punch me right in the feelings, and those are the kinds of games that I wanted to talk about here today. So with no further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into it with our first entry, which just so happens to be Sable. Sable is an interesting game, partially because I never actually bothered to review it, but I did really enjoy playing it. Because Sable is a little different in the sense that it's a sort of coming-of-age story in a very odd civilization where people largely inhabit this desert filled with the ruins of whatever was here prior to them, and they all wear masks and have different jobs associated with those masks, and you are undertaking what they call your gliding. You're going to take a glider, explore the world, and earn these mask fragments as you go. Upon receiving so many of them, you then assemble that mask, with the catch here being that what you're actually doing is essentially earning the right to earn your place among the civilization that you are traveling through. Every mask represents a role in their society, and by earning that mask, you've earned the right to choose that as what you want to do. And this ending resonated with me for quite a few different reasons, mostly because the entire game really is about deciding what that ending is going to be for you, in the sense that you're deciding what role here actually resonates with you. And the catch there is, it's kind of done whenever you feel like it's done. If you want to go out there and experience everything and earn every mask and have every possible choice at the end to then pick whatever it is your character is going to be doing, you are certainly welcome to do that. Or you could go out, complete a couple quests, grab like maybe one mask, decide that's the mask for you, and go straight to the end as quickly as possible. And I think both of those are equally valid purely because the beauty of the ending of Sable is simply that it's entirely up to you. And I suppose then the easiest way to describe it would be via another bit of art, which is a poem called The Fig Tree by Sylvia Plath, which is very well known, with the gist simply being that life is like a branching tree in the sense that there are all sorts of paths and twisting directions your life may lead, but ultimately you do have to pick one of them, or you'll otherwise be unable to choose any of them. And in a strange way, to me at least, I found that Sable really manages to capture that sort of melancholic tone that I've always gotten from reading that poem, and I think maybe that's why it stuck with me for so long then. Nonetheless, a few other games to talk about here, with the next one having an entirely different tone, and that is Another Crab's Treasure. A game I've talked about many times because I really do enjoy it so much, the ending most of all though, but the reason I'm throwing it on this list is admittedly a thinly veiled excuse to mention that it got an update recently, so I was jumping into it to check out that update for like an hour or two. But ultimately, Another Crab's Treasure is like a mini Souls-like title that's all about challenging boss encounters, or you can do the comedic thing and whip out a gun and one-shot the boss, which is equally as funny. But as you go through messing around with this game, enjoying its wild sense of humor and the actual really solid mechanics behind said humor, you may not then be prepared for the ending that really just hit me like a ton of bricks. So the story about Another Crab's Treasure is a hermit crab that is searching for his shell after it got repossessed in the name of taxes, and when you go through all of that, towards the end of the game, somebody rightfully points out that essentially the entire game, as Krill, our hermit crab, you've been searching for this shell only to essentially hide in it and ignore all of these problems that are going on around you, using it as a crutch to avoid taking any action, despite the fact that, as the game itself proves, Krill is very capable of taking action when he wants to. Which is why, after all of that trouble and finally getting your shell back at the end, the game ultimately ends with Krill leaving behind his shell for another crab that needs it a lot more than he does. And I really, really love the ending to this game purely because it's so unexpected in the sense that, I thought it was just going to be a silly, fun little game, and, there is actually a really well done emotional ending that meant a lot more to me than I was really expecting it to, which is obviously what it's doing on this list. Keeping it moving though, third up we have Ghost of Tsushima. Another game which I think, honestly, the story is probably the best part of it, because while it does offer a beautiful coat of paint on some tried and true open world systems with a lot of map markers, the usual stuff, the real highlight here is the story going on around all of those gameplay systems, as we follow the story of Jin trying to free his people from the grip of the Mongols, while also failing to live up to the ideals taught to him by his uncle, which then ultimately culminates in the ending, which is a very direct confrontation between these two ideals, which leads to a very devastating final choice. You see, for Jin's actions, which are considered very dishonorable despite achieving the very same goal of getting rid of the Mongols, he's still essentially sentenced to death, which his uncle, Lord Shimura, is meant to take out, who is tasked with actually following through on these orders. Which ultimately means the final fight of the game is between you and your uncle, who'd been mentoring you since the very beginning. And at the end, you're given a choice to basically kill or spare your uncle. And while that might initially seem like a relatively easy choice, it's vastly more complicated if you've been keeping up with the story up to that point, because on one hand, your uncle has been ordered to do this by the shogun, meaning that it's not something he can turn away from while maintaining his own honor, and in fact, the consequences for sparing him and him failing to actually follow through on this means there's a pretty good chance he's dead anyway. And what's more, he specifically asks you to kill him so that he can die with honor, and Jin gets the benefit of that final reconciliation that honors his uncle's wishes at the same time. And all of that together, I think, makes for a really emotional ending no matter what you actually choose here. But for me, I do think the kill option is the right way to go, because as I mentioned, I think your uncle is likely dead either way. It's literally what your uncle wants and is telling you to do, and I also think it would bring some measure of peace to Jin in its own weird way, having followed this tale to its conclusion only to see how the lessons we give and the actions we take have effects on the people around us, especially in times of change, which is, I would say, a theme that's going to come up even more so here in just a moment. But our second from the end entry here is, of course, Red Dead Redemption 2, a game with a really incredible story about redemption, if you'd believe it, but also maintaining your honor, or lack thereof if you choose, as Arthur Morgan ultimately lives out his final days, seeking to make peace with both the life he's lived and the life he failed to live. Now, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a beautiful game for a lot of different reasons, but none more so than Arthur Morgan's own personal journey through redemption and change, and how even the actions that might not necessarily seem related can ultimately have huge impacts on other people, such as John Marston, and how the story then switches to him in the slightly further in the timeline events of Red Dead Redemption. Now, this is really well known, but Arthur Morgan ultimately contracts tuberculosis from beating a man to death, and moving towards the conclusion of the game, it quickly becomes apparent that it is going to be the death of him, and in this realization of definitely living out his final days, you have some decisions to make. Now, narratively speaking, the kind of clear objective here is to become a better person, but you don't necessarily have to do that. But I do think the ending in which you do attempt those things is much more impactful. Specifically because, no matter how you slice it, Arthur Morgan has not been a good person by any measure up until this point. Even with the most charitable and generous interpretations, he has robbed and stolen and done awful things, both before the game begins and certainly during, to be sure. And yet, when faced with his own mortality, not least of which, but also all of the other events contributing towards that end, snippets from the life he could have led, but ultimately didn't with his prior love interest and everything that went on there, only to then, of course, deal with Dutch, who is ever the schemer, never actually leading with much more than a figment of a plan. And you can do all of those things and ultimately choose to be better, only for all of that to not necessarily improve Arthur Morgan's standing in any real way, but rather how his actions in chasing that redemption affect the people around him, like John Marston probably most directly. And for me at least, that's the part that really spoke to me. Arthur Morgan is, again, simply not a good person, and while you can certainly try to find that redemption and do better things, whether or not that's ultimately successful, I think is likely to be more judged by the impact you had on other people's lives, which to me is something the game tries to drive home with, again, how John Marston goes on to lead his life and change in the wake of all this. So, all said, all told, I think it's just a really beautiful story about not only making peace with the person you've been, but striving to be better and aiming to be the person you wish you could have been, and how your actions and the consequences of them directly impact the people in your lives, which is emotionally resonant, to say the least. So like I would say many people, I really love the ending of Red Dead 2. But that does bring us to our final entry, the one I mentioned at the very top of the video, and it is none other than Clair Obscur Expedition 33. So this game is a story about loss and grief and love, and it's beautifully told. But we're primarily focused on the ending, or the choice between the two different endings you could possibly take, both of which I think are really fantastically well done, even if one is certainly worse than the other. So to dive fully into it, towards the end of the game you learn that Mayel is a bit different in the sense that she is actually a painter. She is not of the world you find yourself in, because the world you find yourself in is in fact the canvas of a painting that was originally made by her brother who passed away. Mayel's mother, the paintress, drowned herself in her brother's canvas, painting and trying to maintain what was left of the piece of his soul that he poured into it, because painters are capable of making their creations into living, breathing worlds, which is what we find ourselves in. Now, the paintress has tried to maintain this and created facsimiles of them and their family, which is who Verso is, the sort of reflection of who her brother actually was. Now, in this revelation, that means that basically the entire world you're in is not real in the strictest sense. Mayel actually entered the painting trying to help out her real sort of family outside of the painting, but became overwhelmed by everything going on here and then was sort of forced into the role of someone born into the society that is sending out expeditions to try to stop the paintress, who are ultimately unaware of what she is and what she's doing, all in the name of grief and love for her lost son. But you only learn this after the paintress is defeated, which is when you have to deal with Mayel's father, who then tries to do what he entered the painting originally to do, which was to shut all this down, basically, and allow the past to be in the past and to, try to move on and heal, even if it's painful in that moment. And then as Mayel, the game continues on for a little bit, as you try to fight your father on this in order to preserve what is left of this world and all the people she has quite literally grown up around and had all of these experiences with, which culminates in a choice, basically, where you can choose to allow the painting to continue preserving all of these people you've met along the way, but ultimately living in the past and refusing to let go of what was, to the detriment of the here and the now. Whereas if you let the painting go, you then have to say goodbye to all of these people and the journey that you've had here in order to make room for a new future. And I think this story is so beautifully well done because, for starters, it does do that sort of like nothing you've experienced up to this point is real per se, but it handles it in such a way that it's very emotionally resonant in the sense that to Mayel, all of this is real. Like, these are experiences that she's had, these are people that she's known, and whether or not they are real in the literal sense, they have impacted her and everyone around her really in very real, substantial ways. She is forever altered because of the time she spent here and the people that she encountered along the way, the memories she had with them. And you can stay here if you want, drowning in your grief for this world, your brother, some stuff I'm glossing over here just to explain this a little faster, or you could do the hard thing and the right thing, which is to let them all go take the things they taught you, look towards the future, and honor who they were, how they've changed you, how you've grown from knowing them, but with the realization that you're never going to see them again. And I think that's an easy parallel to many real-world situations, which is why I think this game is just such an incredible story about overcoming grief. And that is by far and away my favorite thing about the game overall. But that is where I'd like to end this video. It's already gone on a little bit longer than I tend to like to make these, but for today, that is definitely going to do it. I'd love to know what you think about all these down in the comment section below, or certainly any other games with great endings you really enjoyed. So by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.